The Pit and the Pendulum. I was sick to death after a long period of torture and agony. When they finally untied me, I was permitted to sit. I felt as if my senses were leaving me. I was in the hands of the Spanish Inquisition, a harsh panel of judges, and I heard my tormentors give me the sentence of death. After that, the sound of the voices merged into a dreamy hum. The tall candles on the floor sank into nothingness. Their flames went out completely. Darkness overwhelmed me, and all my sensations seemed to be swallowed up in a mad descending rush. Then silence, stillness, and night were all I knew. I had fainted, but kept some sense of where I was and what was happening. I have memories, mere shadows of memories, that tell me I was being carried down, and still further down by tall, silent figures. Very suddenly, motion and sound came back to my soul. The sound of my heart beating, then a pause, and in which all was blank. Then again sound and motion and touch, a tingling sensation all over. Then the mere consciousness of existence without thought, a condition that lasted a long time. Then very suddenly, thought, and shuddering terror, and earnest efforts to understand where I was and what my fate was. Then a strong desire to fall into unconsciousness again. Then a rushing revival of soul and a successful effort to move. Then came a full memory of the trial, of the judges, of the deep black tapestries, of tall candles, of the sentence, of the sickness, and of the swoon. So far I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay on my back, unbound. I reached out my hand, and it fell upon something damp and hard. There I left it for many minutes, while I tried to imagine where and what that thing could be. I could not bring myself to look. I dreaded my first glance at the objects around me. Finally, I opened my eyes, and my worst thoughts were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night surrounded me. The intensity of the darkness oppressed me and made it hard to breathe. I lay quiet and tried to think. Once I remembered that I had been sentenced by the Inquisition. I had tried to understand my real condition. Had I been sent to the dungeon to wait a public execution, which would not take place for several months? This I realized at once could not be the case. Anyone sentenced to death by the Inquisition was executed immediately. Moreover, the dungeon that I'd been in before, as well as all the Inquisition death cells, had stone floors and allowed at least some light. This cell did not. A fearful idea now sent blood rushing into my heart. For a brief period I passed out again. Upon recovering, I tried to get to my feet at once, trembling all over. I thrust my arms wildly above and around me in all directions. I felt nothing, yet I was afraid to move a step for fear that I would find myself trapped inside the walls of a tomb. Perspiration burst from every pore and stood on big, cold beads upon my forehead. The agony of suspense grew unbearable, so I cautiously moved forward with my arms extended and my eyes straining from their sockets in hope of catching some faint ray of light. I took several paces, but all was blackness and emptiness. I breathed more freely. It seemed that I had not been buried alive. Had I been left in this world of darkness to die of starvation? Or was even fearful fate waiting for me? Either way, I knew too well that result would be death, and a bitter death at that. It was only a question of when and how. My outstretched hands finally met a solid wall, very smooth, slimy, and cold. I followed it around, stepping with careful distrust. I had heard about the traps and tricks that the Inquisition played on its prisoners. I could not tell how large the cell was. I tore off a piece of my rough robe that I was wearing and jammed it into a fragment in the cranny of the wall. I could not fail to meet this rag after making one complete trip around the cell, so I thought, but I had not counted on the great size of the dungeon, or in my weakness. The ground was moist and slippery. I staggered onward for some time, then I stumbled and fell. My fatigue made it impossible for me to get up. Soon sleep overtook me. Upon waking and stretching forth an arm, I found beside me a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. I was much too exhausted to wonder about this. I just ate and drank eagerly. Shortly afterward, I resumed my tour around the prison, and with much toil at last came upon the fragment of cloth. After counting my paces, I guessed that the dungeon was 50 yards around. I had met with many angles in the wall, however, so I could not guess about the shape of the vault. I knew that this of mine proved no point, and curiosity kept me going. Leaving the wall, I decided to cross the floor. At first, I walked with extreme caution, for the floor was made of solid material, was coated with slime. After a little while, however, I took courage and began to step firmly. I wanted to cross as in a direct line as possible. After taking about 10 or 12 paces in that manner, my legs became entangled in the torn edge of my robe. I fell violently on my face. In the confusion of the fall, I did not immediately understand how lucky I had been. My chin rested upon the slimy floor of the prison, but my lips and the upper portion of my head touched nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy mist, and a peculiar smell of decayed fungus hit my nostrils. I put my arm forward, then shuddered to discover that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit. I could only guess its depth. I loosened a small rock from the floor and dropped it into the pit. For many seconds I listened to hear it strike something. At last, there was a sullen plunge into water, followed by loud echoes. At the same moment, there came a sound from above, like a quick opening and closing of a door. A faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom and faded away just as suddenly. I saw clearly the doom that had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon the accident that had helped me escape it. Just one more step before my fall, and the world would have seen me no more. The Inquisition reserved two kinds of punishment for its hopeless victims: death preceded by physical torture, or death preceded by mental torture. I had been sentenced to the latter. In my long suffering, I had grown more nervous, until I trembled at the sound of my own voice. I was an excellent candidate for the torments that I now had to suffer through. Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, determined to die rather than risk the terrors of the deep well. In other states of mind, I might have had the courage to end my misery at once by leaping into the pit, but just then I was a coward. I could not forget what I read about pits, that falling into them was only the beginning of torture. My agitated spirit kept me awake for many hours. Finally, I slept again. Upon waking, I found by my side, as before, a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. A burning thirst consumed me, and I emptied the pitcher at once. It must have been drugged, for scarcely had I drunk it before I became irresistibly drowsy. I fell into a deep sleep, like that of death. When I woke up again, I was able to see the objects around me for the first time. A wild, sulphurous light, whose source I could not pinpoint, enabled me to see everything inside my cell. I had been wrong about its size. The whole way around the walls was no more than 25 yards. How could it be so much smaller than I had thought? For some times this fact bothered me in a trivial way. Trivial indeed, for what could be more important under these terrible conditions than the size of my dungeon? Looking around me, I saw the general shape of the prison was a square. Along the walls were heinous and repulsive devices of metal in the shape of fiends, skeletons, and other deathly images. I noticed that the outlines of these monstrosities were distinct, but the colors seemed faded and blurred. I now noticed the floor, too, which was stone, and in the center yawned a circular pit from whose jaws I had barely escaped. All of this I saw indistinctly and by much effort, for the condition had greatly changed while I slept. I now lay on my back, at full length, on a low bed of wood. To this I was securely bound by a long strap passed about my limbs and body. I could move only my head and my left arm. My arm was tied so that I could reach only some chunks of meat in an earthen dish on the floor, and with great effort bring the food to my mouth. I saw to my horror that the pitcher had been taken away. I say to my horror because I consumed with an intolerable thirst. This must have been the goal of those who were torturing me, because the food in the dish was very spicy, making me even more thirsty. Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead, and constructed much the same way as the side walls. In one of the panels, an unusual figure captured my whole attention. It was a painted figure of Father Time. He held what appeared to be a picture image of a huge pendulum, like those we see on clocks. While I gazed directly upward, I thought I saw the pendulum in motion. It moved briefly and slightly, but it definitely moved. I watched it for several minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. I was growing weary of its dull movement when a slight noise drew my attention to the floor. There, I saw several enormous rats. They were coming up from the pit, which lay just within view of my left. While I watched, they came up hurriedly with hungry eyes, lured by the scent of the meat. It took much effort to scare them away. It may have been half an hour, maybe an hour, before I again looked upward. What I saw then amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased its width by nearly a yard. Its speed was also much greater, but what mainly disturbed me was a realization that it had moved lower. I observed with terror that the pendulum was a huge razor made of glittering steel. It swung from a huge rod of brass, and the whole thing hissed through the air as it swept back and forth. I could no longer doubt the doom prepared for me. I knew that surprise or torment was important in the dungeon deaths. I had avoided plunging into the pit by the merest of accidents. Having failed to fall, I would not be simply thrown in. The Inquisition had other, crueler ways to see me off. Why bother telling you of the long, long hours of horror during which I counted the rushing vibrations of the steel, inch by inch, line by line, with a descent barely noticeable. At times it seemed ages. Down and still down it came. Days passed, perhaps many days passed, before it swept so closely over me that it fanned me with its deathly breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed, wore out heaven with my prayers, for the blade to move faster. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful blade. Then I suddenly felt calm. I lay smiling at the glittering death the way that a child looks at some rare toy. I passed out again, only briefly, I thought. It might have been a long time, however, for upon waking I noticed the movement of the pendulum. I knew that there were demons who had taken note of my passing out, so they could slow the blade's descent until they knew that I was watching it again. When I came to, I felt very sick and weak. Even amid the agonies of the period, I craved food. With painful effort, I outstretched my left arm as far as I could, and took hold of the small bits of meat the rats had left behind. As I put a portion of it to my lips, there rushed to my mind the joy of half-formed thought of hope. The pendulum swung back and forth across my chest, right over my heart. Despite its terrifyingly wide sweep, some 20 feet or more, and the hissing cruelty of its descent, it could still take several minutes just to cut through my clothes. I forced myself to think about how the blade would sound as it passed across my garments, upon the particular throwing sensation that the friction of the cloth produces on my nerves, and I thought about this until my teeth were on the edge. I alternately laughed and howled as I considered its ruthless power. Down, relentlessly down. The blade vibrated within 3 inches of my chest. I struggled violently, furiously to free my left arm. This was free only from the elbow to the hand. As I said, I could reach my hand from the bowl beside me and to my mouth only with great effort. If I could have broken the fastenings above my elbow, I might have tried to grab the pendulum and tried to stop it. I might as well have tried to stop an avalanche. Down it came. I gasped and struggled against each vibration. I shrunk lower at its every sweep. I saw that some 10 or 12 sweeps would bring the seal in contact with my robe, and there suddenly came over my spirit all the keen, collected calmness of despair. For the first time during many hours, perhaps days, I had a clear thought. It occurred to me that the strap that bound me was the only thing that held me to the wooden table. The first stroke of the razor across any portion of the strap would let me unwind it, but how fearfully near the steel would have to be at that time, how deadly the slightest struggle. Besides, wasn't it likely the Inquisitioners had foreseen this possibility? Was it likely that the strap had crossed my chest was directly in the track of the pendulum? Afraid to find my last faint hope. My last faint hope frustrated. I raised my hand as far as possible to look at my chest. The strap crossed my limbs and body in all directions, except the path of the pendulum. I could not count on the steel to free me. Scarcely had dropped my head back into its original position when there flashed upon my mind an unformed, dim idea of deliverance. I proceeded at once, with the nervous energy of despair, to try to carry it out. For many hours, the area around my wooden bed had been swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, hungry. Their red eyes glared upon me as if they only waited for my motionless to make me their prey. What food, I thought, have they been used to getting into this dungeon? Despite my best efforts, they had devoured all but a small portion of my meat. I had tried to brush them away with my free hand, but the fierce vermin fastened their sharp fangs into my fingers. Only particles of the oily meat chunks remained, but I rubbed them wherever I could on the strap holding me to the bed. Then, raising my hand from the floor, I lay breathlessly still. At first, the ravenous animals were startled and terrified by my movements. They shrank back in alarm. Many went back into the well, but only for a moment. Their fierce appetites served me well. Noticing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest rats leaped onto the bed and smelled the strap. This seemed to be the signal for the general invasion. Out of the pit they scurried. They crawled all over me by the hundreds. They measured movements of the pendulum and disturbed them not at all. Avoiding its strokes, they busied themselves with chewing on the greasy strap. They pressed, even swarmed upon me in ever-growing heaps. They writhed upon my throat, their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. A disgust for which the world has no name swelled my bosom and chilled my heart with a heavy calmness. Yet in 1 minute I felt that the struggle would be over. I could feel the strap getting looser. I knew that it must be already being chewed through in more than one place. With a more than human willpower, I lay still. My endurance was rewarded. At last I was free. The strap had been chewed to pieces, but the stroke of the pendulum, however, pressed against my chest. Through my robe. Twice it swung, and a sharp pain shot through every nerve. The moment of escape had arrived. At a wave of my hand, the rat scurried away. With a steady movement, cautious, sidelong, shrinking, and slow, I slid out of the embrace of the strap and beyond the reach of the blade. For the moment, at least, I was free. Free, but still in the grip of the Inquisition. I had scarcely stepped from the wooden bed of terror when the horrible machine stopped. I saw it being pulled back up to the ceiling by some invisible force. It was a lesson that I took desperately to heart. Every moment of certainly being watched. Free, but I had escaped death in one form of agony, to be delivered into worse than death of another. With that thought, I rolled my eyes nervously around, looking at the iron barriers that hemmed me in. Something unusual, some change that I could not grasp at first, had taken place in the room. I fell into many minutes of dreamy and trembling trance of useless, unconnected thoughts. During this period, I became aware for the first time where the sulphurous light that lit my cell was coming from. It came from a crack about half an inch wide that extended around the prison at the base of the walls. I knelt down and tried to look through the crack, but to no avail. As I arose from the attempt, I could finally see in my fresh eyes how the chamber was being changed. The metal figures lining the walls were glowing fiendishly from an intense heat that they gave off. Demon eyes, wild and ghastly, glared upon me in 1,000 directions where none had been visible before. Unreal, even as I breathed the smell of the heated iron came to my nostrils, the suffocating odor swept throughout the prison. A deeper glow settled each moment in my eyes that glared agonies. I panted. I gasped for breath. There could be no doubt for the design of my tormentors. Oh, most unrelenting and demonic of men. I shrank from the glowing metal and back to the center of the cell. Into my thoughts of fiery destruction, the idea of a cool well came over my soul like a healing ointment. I rushed to the pit's deadly brink and looked below. The glare from the red-hot room lit every inch of the pit, yet I could not find the courage to jump. With a shriek, I rushed away from the edge and buried my face in my hands, weeping bitterly. The heat increased rapidly, and once again I looked up, shuddering. There had been a second change in the cell. 2 of its walls had begun to move toward me with a low, rumbling sound. I could have clasped the red walls to my chest with a garment of eternal peace. Death, I said, any death but that of the pit. It was the pit, however, that I was slowly being pushed towards. The room grew flatter and flatter as the wall was moved in with a speed that left me no time to think. I shrank away, but the unstoppable walls kept pressing me back towards the pit. At length, my burning and writhing body had not even an inch of foothold on the firm prison floor. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. I tottered at the brink of the pit. Suddenly, I heard shouts and screams outside the cell. There was a loud blast of many trumpets. There was a hard, pounding sound of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back away from me. Even so, I could stay conscious no longer. Fainting, I began to fall into the abyss. Just in time, an outstretched arm caught me. It was General Lassalle. The French army had taken the city. I was free, and the Spanish Inquisition was in the hands of its enemy.